Thank you so much. Yes, you are in the right place. This is the first Hunt Institute Race and Education webinar series episode. So grateful for your attendance, your engagement, your enthusiasm, and your excitement about this conversation with Denise Ford, Vice President for Partnerships and Engagement at the Education Trust, Angelique Albert, Director of the American Indian Graduate Center, Michael Smith, Executive Director of the My Brothers Keeper Alliance, and Christian Arana, Policy Director of the Latino Community Foundation. Thank you so much for joining in, and we are so excited to have you, so excited for your enthusiasm, so excited to have this conversation, this critical conversation about the role race plays in our education system. And with that, I am going to turn it over to the Hunt Institute's Fearless Executive Director, President and CEO, Javed Siddiqui, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, to start us off and to give opening comments about the importance of this webinar series. So thank you so much, Javed.
Thank you, Senegal, and thanks for your work on this, creating this series. Welcome to the first installment of the Hunt Institute's new webinar series, Race and Education. As Senegal mentioned, my name is Javed. I do have the good fortune of serving as the president of the Hunt Institute. If this is your first connection with the Institute, we were created by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt to support education policy needs of governors, state lawmakers, and other senior level state officials. As our country grapples with the global pandemic and a renewed conversation around racial equity and justice in light of the murder of George Floyd, we at the Institute knew we needed to do more to talk about the educational inequities experienced by children of color specifically. These injustices, as well as America's response, the protesting, the fighting for change, have inspired us at the Institute to do more and to highlight racial inequality in America. As such, we've been bringing together leaders working in this space to have a set of critical conversations designed to provoke our thinking and to lead to changes in policy that support better outcomes for our communities of color. Our conversation today is the first installment of our Race and Education series, which will be an ongoing series addressing topics such as policing in schools, implicit bias, culturally responsive curriculum, one I'm really looking forward to, teacher diversity, and many more. I sincerely hope that you will be able to join us for all these webinars, share the invitations with those in your network, and work with us to find tangible solutions for removing systemic barriers for children of color. I'd like to thank Michael Smith, Angelique Albert, and Christian Arana, our guests today, for your commitment and your willingness to share your expertise and enthusiasm for supporting students of color. I'm looking forward to learning more about your work and how we at the Institute might be able to support you. I'm also delighted to have Denise Ford, who's the Senior Vice President for Partnerships and Engagement at the Education Trust, a great partner organization. Denise is also a member of the Hunt Institute's Board of Directors, which is code for my boss. So I'm thankful for Denise. Denise has a true love for this work, and I'm so honored to have her kick this series off and could not think of a better person to moderate this discussion. Denise, your partnership and friendship are so important to me and the Institute as a whole, and we thank you so much. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Denise, to get our conversation going and offer some welcome remarks.
Thank you, Javed, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I hope that I can moderate a lively and compelling discussion with these wonderful panelists. I am Denise Ford, Senior Vice President for the Education Trust. I work on partnership and engagement strategy for the organization. First, I just wanted to share, I'm right now sitting about 1.5 miles from the US Capitol, where our hero, John Lewis, currently lies in state. It is not a moment lost on any of us of the role that he had in making sure that pretty much all of us on this panel are where we are today. I hesitate to even try to really express what John Lewis meant and continues to mean when it comes to education, and in particular, the work that we do at the Education Trust. We know that inequities do not exist in a vacuum, and perhaps it's even clearer now with the dual crises of the pandemic and overt racism that we are seeing that education, healthcare, food insecurity, housing insecurity are all rising up at this moment and being laid bare. At the Education Trust, we try to identify these inequities. We want to use research and data, But more importantly, we want to use this research and data to empower you in your communities to make significant change. And that significant change for us starts with education policy. We know through this particular pandemic that parents are concerned about how their children are going to go back to school. We know that parents of color in particular have experienced challenges with distant learning. They've expressed challenges with the number of times they've been able to engage with their instructors in the classroom. But most of these inequities are not new. And in fact, they are the result of racism and bias baked into our institutions and our instruction and our structures, from employment to housing to the healthcare system to the education system. So I'm looking forward to working with this panel today as part of the Hunt Institute, one of our favorite partners, and hear from everybody about the questions you might have for this panel as we explore race and education. Senegal, were you going to provide some additional information to our panelists, or should I introduce them now?
Please introduce.
Okay, great. We have three amazing folks. You've heard their names several times already, but let me ask Michael Smith, who's the Executive Director of My Brother's Keeper Alliance, Angelique Albert, Director of the American Indian Graduate Center, and Christian Arana, who's the Policy Director at the Latino Community Foundation, to talk individually about their work and their organizations. And then I would really like to hear from you guys, who are the young people your organization serves, and what is one challenge those young people are facing within the education system right now? Michael, I'll turn to you first.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me today. This is really such an honor and privilege to be with such an esteemed panel. Denise, thank you. Dr. Siddiqui, thank you. Christian, Angelique. Angelique is one of my bosses. She's on our board for My Brother's Keeper Alliance, and then Senegal Mabry is also on our board. So it's like old home week. It's good to be with family, and it's good to be with so many folks that care so passionately about our shared mission of making sure that our young people can achieve their dreams. My Brother's Keeper Alliance and My Brother's Keeper actually has its roots in the same roots of the Black Lives Matter movement. It was after not only the tragic killing of Trayvon Martin, but also that horrific verdict where George Zimmerman was allowed to walk away. And you may have remembered that President Obama at that time surprised the press briefing corps and just tried to give voice to the anger and the angst that Americans were feeling, especially parents of boys and young men of color and boys and young men of color themselves. And he said at that time, and that was summer of 2013, he said, if I had a son, it could have been Trayvon. He said, Trayvon could have been me. And he said, there has to be more that we can do to make sure young men of color know that their country cares about them and is willing to invest in them. And fast forward about 6 months later in the East Room of the White House, President Obama signed a presidential memorandum to create the My Brother's Keeper initiative. And the idea was, how do we reduce the barriers that stand in the way of boys and young men of color achieving their dreams, and how do we expand opportunity in the same time? And he put the full weight of the federal government behind it, looking at policy interventions, things like Second Chance Pell, and reforming school discipline, new work on chronic absenteeism, thinking about correctional education. It was all rooted actually in the cradle to career to college milestones, these 6 milestones. 4 of them are education related. And so really looking at what it would take to make sure that our young men could thrive. And so that's why My Brother's Keeper was launched. My Brother's Keeper now lives as an initiative of the Obama Foundation, where we're really trying to build a national coalition, creating a call to action to make sure that our boys and young men of color live in safe and supportive communities where they know that they matter and that there are clear pathways to opportunity. And so when I think about that population that we're serving, it's these young men. These mostly the work of My Brother's Keeper goes between the ages of 0 to 24. But you look at young men who are bright, They have incredible possibility, they have incredible talent, and we all know that saying that says, talent is distributed evenly, but opportunity is not. And frankly, America has never invested in young men of color. From 1619 to today, every obstacle that could be thrown in the path of young men of color has been thrown there, and we're seeing the results in these ridiculous opportunity gaps. And so when I think about the challenges that our young men are facing in education, you can look at so many statistics. Back in the Obama administration, when My Brother's Keeper was being founded, we were celebrating higher graduation rates. We had finally turned the curve on the high school dropout crisis. I think we were looking at first at 80% high school dropout rate. But if you happen to be Black, Latinx, or a tribal young man of color, you were looking at graduation rates below 50%. I think that year we were looking at data from Rochester that was showing they were graduating around 20% of the Black males in Rochester. And so if you look at those sorts of opportunity gaps that are a direct correlation to underfunded schools, over-policed schools, not the same opportunity and access and investment that's being given in more affluent communities, you can see the results. And then if you layer this horrible pandemic that we've had with COVID, you have to worry even more about the fragile connections of so many young people that might have already been on the edge, and what it means that mom and dad might not be working now, what it means that the program that was helping you get over the edge may not any longer be there, what it means that economic downturn is changing your potential economic conditions. And so I'm really worried about the already fragile safety net that we had for young men of color and what it means in this COVID context that also has a disproportionate effect on boys and young men of color and their families. But excited to be working with folks that have ideas and solutions on how we can begin to change the game, even in the midst of this crisis.
Thank you. The work of the Alliance is so important. And as you pointed out, even now during the pandemic, probably even more important. Angelique, love to hear from you about your work and your organization and some of the challenges that your youth are facing right now.
Yes, thank you. Just good morning to you all, and thank you for having me here today. American Indian Graduate Center is the largest scholarship provider to Native youth in this country. We serve students in all 50 states from 574 federally recognized tribes and 63 state recognized tribes. We provide scholarships for students in undergraduate, graduate, and professional degrees in any field of study at any accredited college. So we do fund students in Ivy League schools, mainstream universities, tribal colleges, community college. We kind of run the gamut. In addition, we do college prep for high school students in Indian country. So kind of gives you an idea. We've been around 50 years. And really, we're at the helm of the tribal higher education kind of initiative in this country. So gives you a little bit about our background. When I think about the one challenge that we as Indigenous people have in education is invisibility. When you think of the false narratives that are out there, the inaccurate or completely missing history that surrounds us as Native people really leads to racial biases and inaccurate stereotypes in education and our community kind of on a broader level. Rarely do you hear about us as Native people, as contemporary beings, or hear about contemporary Native issues. I don't know how many times I've heard that we as Native people are statistically insignificant. And something that really sticks to me is when my middle school son came to me from school. We had just moved from Montana to Southeast Texas, and he came home and he was a little perplexed as to why his teachers were teaching him that all Native people were dead and killed in this country. So all that to say that there's really, whether you're talking about K-12 education or higher education, there's a complete lack of curriculum, teachers, professors, support students, and funding to support our students, our Native students. So when you look at, even if you're just looking at K-12, less than half of the states in this country have Native curriculum. And those that do, it's really focused on just the Native students or the Native tribes in that particular state. And it's all prior to 1900. So if you can imagine, teaching our children, whether it's business, technology, economics, and you could only learn what was there prior to 1900, it really does a disservice to our students, where it puts them at a disadvantage, and just brings me back to that point that, how are our Native students feeling when they enter these school systems? I'm sure they felt like my son did, and all of our sons, when they're sitting with a group of students and teachers who are telling them that all of their ancestors were killed off, when, it just makes you feel, I come back to that point, invisible. So for us as Native people, I really feel like invisibility is kind of the biggest problem.
Thank you, Angelique. That is so powerful. I want to remind folks to add your questions in the Q&A, and we also have hashtags for this event. And I'm going to share those with you. They are, hold on one second, sorry. Hashtag race, capital R, race, and capital E, education, and hashtag MBKA. And again, please make sure you put your questions in the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen, and we will definitely try to answer as many questions as we can during the time that we have left. Christian, I'm going to turn to you as the policy director at the Latino Community Foundation. Can you talk about the young people that the foundation serves, and also share one pressing challenge those students are facing within the education system?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, and thank you so much, Denise, for moderating, and thank you to the Hunt Institute and my fellow panelists for joining this morning. So the Latino Community Foundation, so we're California's only philanthropic organization that is focused on the Latino community. I'll say that one more time. We are California's only philanthropic organization that is focused specifically on the Latino community. It's still mind-blowing to me to this day that in a state with over 15 million Latino people that live in our state, 54% of our students within California's public schools are Latino, that there's only one organization that is focused on investing in this grassroots organizing for Latino families, especially within the education system. So it's a point of pride for us, but also it's a stark reminder about the gaps in philanthropic funding when it comes to organizing around important topics like education, right? So the organizations that we invest in primarily work with young people. So from Los Angeles to California Central Valley, all the way up to wine country, so Napa and Sonoma. It's not just fancy wineries and resorts. There are actual people that live there. These are the children of farm workers and farm workers themselves. And so, when it comes to our funding, like we've always held this strong belief that, it's young people for lack of a better word, that they're going to get us out of this mess, right? And I think we're seeing that in real time right now. When these students are not going to school, they're working with their local Latino nonprofit. They're organizing around important issues like defund the police, as we're seeing right now. They're also just working, period, during this global pandemic. They're the grocery store workers, they're the dreamers, they're the nurses that are in hospitals taking care of COVID-19 patients. And many who we know are actually farm workers themselves. They're actually in the fields with their parents as they try to navigate this global pandemic with them. So to your question about what's the one big pressing challenge, I'm sure we'll talk about this a lot, but it's the digital divide. Our governor, California Governor Gavin Newsom, has already said that public schools, for the most part, are going to be going virtually this fall. California has now the most cases of COVID-19 across this country. But how on earth are Latino students supposed to make this pivot virtually when prior to this pandemic, barely half of us even have access to broadband, right? Race has become a factor in who has access to broadband, let alone a laptop or a smartphone, right? When we talk to our partners we have cases where students are literally going to the parking lot of a McDonald's to get Wi-Fi. There are other cases where only one person in the family has access to a smartphone, and all three children in the family are using the phone to do homework. It is so mind-blowing to me that in the state of California, we're home to the biggest tech giants like Apple and Google and Facebook and Twitter and you name it. But yet somehow we cannot bring this type of technology to our communities. And I've always long believed that the digital divide has always been a choice. We can choose to end it today if we want to, but who among us is actually gonna have the courage to actually change it, right? Because it goes well beyond just, let me give a bunch of kids laptops and hotspots and all that. It needs to be more systematic than that. So we've been having conversations with our partners on the ground, with the students that they work with, to try to figure out how we solve this quickly and systemically as well.
Thank you, Christian. I was asked to repeat the hashtag. It's hashtag race, capital RACE, and capital E education. I also put it in the chat, and there are a number of questions coming in, so we really appreciate that. Angelique, can you talk a little bit more? The American Indian Graduate Center is the largest scholarship provider in the country for American Indian students looking to attend college. You spoke a little bit already about the challenges they're facing in the current education landscape. Can you talk to the supports that you've put in place or already increased to better equip your students for the road ahead?
Yes, absolutely. I know that when we talk about kind of racial equity in higher education, I also think it's important to acknowledge just a conversation about, you know, starting at having different starting points. You know, some of us have the ability to say, yes, my grandfather and my mother, my parents, they went to college. And some of us have the ability to say that, you know, my mom was a single parent and worked hard to put me through college. And other people, you know, like me included, have to say that, you know, my mother's generation and my grandfather's generation went to boarding school. So just acknowledgement of that history and that there are different starting points with that. So what we have done as an organization to really it really adds support. We have a student support team with academic advisors. We learned early on that it's not enough just to throw scholarship dollars at a student and say, good luck with that. You know, we really had to put support services in place. You know, we reach out to students on a consistent basis. They each have academic advisors with our organization. We do different assessment tools to see if they need academic support, connect them to resources on campuses, seeing if they need financial aid assistance or advocacy in that area. So we add that. We do a lot of training, you know, particularly around self-advocacy and navigating landscapes that the students aren't particularly used to, like how to get into grad school. So we provide that training. And then also during this very difficult time, you know, just piggybacking on what Christian said, you know, the digital divide is huge, and the impacts of COVID to our communities has been we've been hit so hard that, you know, we've had to pivot and provide additional services to them, you know, gas money to get to that, you know, Walmart parking or the Starbucks parking lot to get Wi-Fi or whatever it is, you know, to be able to finish their schooling. So that's kind of what we do. And then just on a broader level, we support campuses that, you know, we provide funding to students in about 1,700 campuses across this country. And in the past 50 years, it's very easy to see which ones are creating supportive environments for Native students. It is the colleges that have Native curriculum, that have Native professors, that have cohort models and Native support services. And the ones that are really doing an excellent job are the ones that also have tribal celebrations at their campuses, so students feel included. So we funnel a lot of our 15 million annually to those schools.
Thank you, Angelique. Michael, your alliance, you have milestones, and one of them speaks to keeping kids on track and giving them second chances. Can you share with us about what that milestone means in the education sphere, and especially in this moment, thinking about policing in schools and school discipline?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is directly about disrupting the school to prison pipeline. And making sure that we are not criminalizing our children, which America tends to do when it comes to its Black and brown children. Starting from the earliest ages. We know, for instance, if you are an African-American student, you make up 16% of the public school population, but 42% will be suspended, 34% expelled. And so if you look at the disproportionality rates of that, it's unbelievable. It's unacceptable. ABC News did a study not so long ago that showed, I believe the study was in 2019, so last year, that showed more than 30,000 young people under the age of 10 had been arrested. So we are not only we're not only looking at the challenges that we see when young people get older, but we're looking at policing coming in as early as kindergarten. You'll see some of the studies, like when we were in the Obama administration, you'll see school suspensions and expulsions and police involving for flatulence or willful defiance or just kids being kids. And obviously the data shows that it's more likely if you happen to have brown or Black skin. And that's wholly, wholly unacceptable. And you can see that rate going all the way up until we look at, if you are Black, by the time you're 25, you're 1 in 2 chance of being arrested. And then if you look at the disproportionality in the prison population, you see a direct correlation. And we know that that begins early, not only with school discipline, but for instance, we look at third grade reading rates, which I know that we are also heavily focused on, where we have way too many Black and brown students that are not reading at grade level by 3rd grade. And we've learned that those are the numbers that prisons use to determine how many beds they're going to build, because of the direct correlation between 3rd grade reading levels, high school dropout rates, and what will happen with young men of color and their interaction with the criminal justice system. And then sadly, as you look at the recent uprising after the tragic killing of George Floyd and way too many others, we have had to look at the statistic that shows that the police kill about, on average, 1,000 people every year, and Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed. And most of those happen to be men of color. And so when we think about the idea that, we call it our 6 milestones, that our young people should be safe from violence and that they should be given second chances, that also has to be safe from police violence. And so we have to figure out a way to make sure that our schools are places of learning, are places of love, are places of opportunity, are places where our children know that they can go to have someone wrap an arm around them, to be there to give them a second chance when they make a mistake, just like any other student would, and not to be criminalized. We've also seen the data, and I know the Obama administration's education department was so big into this, the data that shows 2 million students, almost 2 million students attend school with police and no guidance counselors. And so we've got to change the game. If we love our children, we've heard a lot of the idea that budgets are moral documents, or we know this idea that, I'll show you what you love if I can look at where you spend your money and where you spend your time. We've got to invest in loving our children and lifting up our children and making sure that they are safe and they have pathways to opportunities and not pathway to prison. And so we have MBK communities, MBK partner organizations all across the country that are working on changing that game, working on new mentoring programs in schools, working on community and school partnerships, working on diversion programs instead of arrest programs, working on restorative justice. President Obama talks about this a lot of growing up in Hawaii. He said, I made a lot of mistakes. I just happened to grow up in an environment that was a little bit more forgiving. And we all know, especially for those of us that grew up maybe in poor communities and over-policed communities, and we go to college and we meet more white folks and they're like, oh, you did that too? You tried that drug? You stole that thing? You didn't end up getting arrested. There wasn't a police officer that was there watching your every move. Kids make mistakes. That's what kids do. And we have to make sure that they live in a country that's going to let them make those mistakes and have an opportunity not to make sure that their mistake follows them for the rest of their lives.
Thank you, Michael. Christian, the Latino Community Foundation's work on the Schools and Communities First initiative, which would tax commercial and industrial properties at market prices rather than their original sales price, and the proposition to repeal the ban on affirmative action in California. Would love to hear more about your work in both of those areas. And how do you think these bills will actually help change education policy for Latinx Californians? Yeah,
absolutely. So I think first, I think it's important to contextualize these propositions against where California once was in its history. So contrary to public belief, California hasn't always been like this hippy dippy liberal, bastion of like progressivism, right? Back in the late 1970s, California passed Proposition 13, which limited how much homeowners and commercial property owners would pay in their property taxes, right? This is how local school districts would receive their funding. But at the time, there was a struggling economy, a changing demographic. And at that moment, California voters said, you know what? Like, I want to limit the amount of money that I'm paying into the system, right? It's like this idea of like, why would I send my money over there kind of thing, right? And that happened again in the 1990s. I was in elementary school at the time during all of this, but California voters voted to ban education for undocumented immigrants. We also banned bilingual education. And also, if that wasn't enough, we also voted to ban the end of the use of affirmative action in higher education. And so all of this really happened against the backdrop of a crumbling economy, a monumental demographic shift where it was Latinos, Asian Americans that were growing in population, and people started getting jumpy, right? Does any of that sound familiar today, right, in the year 2020? So for us, to your question, Denise, we're strongly supporting Schools and Communities First, which is known as Prop 15 on this year's November ballot, and also Prop 16. For us, as a philanthropic organization, if all we're doing is cutting checks to grassroots organizations, we're really not doing anything. We really want to stand with our grantees and advocate for this long-term systemic change, right? And as a 501c3 community foundation, like, we can lobby. And I think a lot of community foundations may not already know that, but for us, like, this is a moment in time in which we need to fight with our community. So just to go into the specifics, so if Prop 15, the Schools and Communities First initiative passes, we're essentially going to change how we tax commercial and industrial properties, right? Like you mentioned, they've been paying taxes based on the original purchase price, the 1970s price on their property. So the best way to think about it, as we've been communicating with our partners, is we're finally going to tax Mickey Mouse. So Disneyland is literally going to be affected by this. And as opposed to paying the taxes from back in the day, Disneyland is actually going to have to pay the market value of actually having that Disneyland property. If it passes this November, local schools and communities will reclaim $12 billion, each year. So to the point of Michael and Angelique about like just funding in general, this is exactly what we're talking about. How we change how we tax these commercial and industrial properties. This is how we bring back money so that we can have more counselors, right? We can have more nurses. California is already towards the bottom when it comes towards per pupil spending. I was actually talking with one of my staff members the other day. She went to a public school in LA. The nurse came every Wednesday. So basically the message was Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, you can't get sick. And that was because the school didn't have funding, right? So the impact of this is going to be huge for Latino students, not just Latino students, but all students of color in general, because it's more counselors, it's more nurses, more librarians, you name it, right? Getting the money is half the game, right? When it comes to Prop 16, which is the fight to repeal the ban on affirmative action. As you can imagine, if this actually passes this November, it's going to be huge for Latino students in general. The LA Times the other day had an article about how they enrolled the largest class of Latino students ever, right? This is just the beginning, right? And if you think about it, that the ban on affirmative action happened about 25 years ago. This is California. It has now taken us 25 years to get to this point where we're now entertaining this conversation. And to think about it, both schools and communities first and the fight to repeal the ban on affirmative action, they need to be seen hand in hand, right? Because for far too long, right, these are the types of racist systemic policies that have been going on in our state that have debilitated not just Latino students, but just all students of color and actually achieving their educational dreams, right? Because as we all know, what happens in the classroom is super important, but it's so much more than that, right? When we actually put students of color on a pathway to success that begins first with education, right? We need to make sure that we're funding that we're providing more access to it, because in the end, it's going to benefit our economy, right? California is already the 5th largest economy in the world by ourselves. And I'm not an economist, but I do wonder if every student of color had an opportunity to thrive in our state, I guarantee we would probably be second or third largest economy in the world. And to this day, I still don't get it. Like, why are we still having this conversation? I just want all of our elected officials and our communities to fight for this.
Well, thank you for pushing back against it, and also for highlighting that the people's voice can matter, especially with these 2 propositions. And they matter in the fight against structural racism, which you also talked about. We have a number of questions from the audience, so I thought I'd pull up some of those now and keep them coming. From Myra for Angelique: how can parents and communities advocate for responsive curriculum for children of color, especially in predominantly white communities?
Well, I think it's really reaching out to the tribal communities and partnering through and doing advocacy work. There are many Native organizations that you can work with. Definitely encourage you to reach out to me. But also it's really creating with allies kind of appropriate curriculum too. So when you look at some of the research that was done around, I'm trying to remember the name, Reclaiming Native Youth. I'm going to give a shout out to Crystal Echohawk and the work that she's done. And it really was a lot of research to identify, some of the misconceptions and really to help us connect with allies and partners. And that has transformed into a movement called Illuminative. And I encourage you to reach out to Crystal and her team, because they have also created a curriculum. They've partnered with the National Indian Education Association and some other partners to develop a curriculum. So I would just really encourage that. And it's done in a way that is very inclusive and working with partnerships and allies to really build those bridges. So I would just really encourage reaching out to Crystal and her team, or me, or any other national Native organization, or in your community tribes. The tribes in your communities have education departments, and really to start building those bridges and those collaborative partnerships.
Thanks, Angelique. We have another question from Heather Harding for Christian. What policies do we need to advocate for on this digital divide issue that you spoke about earlier, Christian?
Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Great. So yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot. Well, first of all, we need to close it. We need to close it fast, right? So I know we've been talking about the federal level. I'm not sure where that conversation is at the federal level right now, but it's important to close it, because obviously we understand the importance of it to education, but it's jobs, right? So many people have lost their jobs during this pandemic. So what through policy can we craft to make sure that we're working with the major telecom companies that we're working to make sure that we're uplifting the voices of people who are living in rural communities, right? Because too often the case, people want access to broadband, but either the major company will say, well, it's just too expensive. We don't want to go out there. So how can we create incentives at whatever level of government, really, to actually incentivize the construction of more broadband internet access, what have you, to more rural communities that actually experience like a very hard time when it comes to the digital divide. And I also think this is an important role that tech needs to play. That's why I mentioned Apple and Google and Facebook during my earlier remarks. I have a reputation of going after them a lot, but they have a responsibility at this moment in time in our history. It's not just about taking down fake news, right, on Facebook and Twitter. I think they need to understand that if they want to build their next workforce, the next generation of the people that work for those companies, they need to understand that they need to make these investments and actually engage in policy, right? It's also in their interest, because at the end of the day, it could actually mean more Facebook users and more advertisers or whatever it is, right? So I think finding ways to incentivize the construction of this, of broadband and internet access, I think would help to start closes, I hope, and bringing in more allies.
Thank you, Christian. The challenges around remote learning are so broad. And if we really want to make sure that our students are keeping pace or that we continue to see progress, we're going to have to do something about the digital divide. The Senate recently released just last night their proposal for stimulus. And I'm sad to report does not include any increased funding for E-rate or any new funding to address the digital divide that also exists for students of color and students from low-income family and higher education who are returning home because their schools are closed, but also don't have internet access. So thank you for calling that out. Also had another question from Jean to Michael. Are there any local or state systems that are getting this challenge to racism right? And could you also talk about My Brother's Keeper's work with the mayors?
Yeah, sure. One of the most important parts of the work of My Brother's Keeper Alliance is the continuation of the My Brother's Keeper Community Challenge, which was launched back in 2014 in the Obama White House. And the idea behind that was communities have been working on the issues facing boys and young men of color for many, many years. But maybe it wasn't with the level of urgency. Maybe it wasn't getting the attention it needed. Maybe folks wanted to talk about it and not talk about race. I can't tell you how many mayors I've talked to over the years that said, President Obama gave us the space in the room to actually talk about the intersection to race and opportunity in a way that we couldn't do before. So we created this My Brother's Keeper Community Challenge, really calling on mayors, county executives, tribal leaders to come up with their own policy scan, looking at what's working and what's not in their community as it relates to boys and young men of color, and also creating their own action plan. What are the strategies that they were going to put together, working as a collective and a community to make a difference? And by the time we left the Obama administration, we had nearly 250 communities and all 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico, and 19 tribal nations that are really working on their own efforts to close opportunity gaps for boys and young men of color. And so if you go to our website at obama.org, you can see where the closest MBK community is to you and hopefully find a way to get involved. And I think to the earlier question, the most important aspect of that work is starting with data. Data. If you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. And so one of the most boring things we did in the Obama administration, but I think that is most important, was making sure that we were sharing the data and putting out not only critical indicators of life success for boys and young men of color, but access to data so you can actually finally see the intersection between race and gender in a way that you couldn't do before. And so communities were starting there, looking at the data, finding out what the disparities were, and then being really willing to talk about what the racial aspects of those are and looking at solutions that track those together. And so you can see communities like Boston, Houston, I think is a great example because the work has now gone over 2 mayors, originally taken by Mayor Parker, and now Mayor Turner does this work. It's led and the Department of Health and Human Services through the city of Houston, and they actually sit around the table with education leaders, with other city leaders to look at the agenda for boys and young men of color. And another great example to look at is My Brother's Keeper in New York State, where New York State is the only state that has actually invested from a state level to do the work of My Brother's Keeper. And now for about 5 years in a row, there's been $20 million a year to invest in the work of My Brother's Keeper that's actually being led by schools and school districts across the country. So it's led out of the Board of Education and the Board of Regents and the state of New York. So that would be another great place to look at. And then I would say, California, you said it wasn't something before, but it is something now. And there's a great California Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. We are working specifically, we invest with Liberty Hill Foundation in LA County. We invest with Sierra Health Foundation in Sacramento. And these organizations are coming to the table, not only looking at successful programs, but really looking at policy solutions that can change the game for boys and young men of color, and making sure that young men of color are involved in coming up with those solutions, and then actually going to Sacramento to be a part of the fight. So the efforts to close youth prisons, to remove school resource officers, those were things that have come out of the My Brother's Keeper table across the state of California, led by young people, and you've seen serious results. So we list a lot of those stories on our website. Encourage you to take a look.
Keeping on that sort of ability to change the narrative, Angelique, I would love to have you talk about some of the work you are doing, highlighting the students who are receiving scholarships and elevating the narrative for American Indian youth across the country. Can you talk about how those efforts celebrating young people really help to change the narrative and actually move from invisibility to visibility?
Absolutely, yes. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, it's just fun to celebrate accomplishments with our youth. I think that we all can say that education is really transformative, and to celebrate is really. To Michael's earlier point, when we look at our graduation rates in this country, particularly Native students, for undergraduates, it lingers around 38 to 41%, which is really, really sad. But through our support services and the funding that we really put to those support services, we're able to get those undergraduate degrees in some of our programs up to almost 70%. And then some of our graduation rates, we have up to 95%. So, and those are very targeted programs, but taking a moment to highlight that student success, I think that really, it sets the bar as a role model for younger students, and also really shows potential and opportunity. But when you look at the history of Native higher education, I'm going to go back to this. 50 years ago when we started our efforts, there were 38 tribal lawyers in this country. There were 15 Native doctoral students, and there were 13 medical doctors in the entire United States. And through our support and efforts, we're happy to say that we've contributed to over 2,000 law degrees, 1,700 PhDs, and 450 medical degrees. So we feel that also tells a story. It changes the narrative that we're no longer in the 1800s, that we have people in our communities really contributing to society in a number of ways. It's really, it brings me a lot of pride to say that we have been able to contribute to the education of Congresswoman Deb Haaland. That sets the bar for our other young women out there, for our young Native women out there. And we do have our own challenges going on, with missing and murdered Indigenous women. But when you see someone at that level that looks like you, it really changes the narrative for the external audience, and for us internally, makes things possible.
Thank you, Angelique. And you are so right. I mean, in that being able to see yourself in our leaders, whether it's the leaders in the classroom, leaders in the community, leaders in Congress, that absolutely helps change the narrative for young people. I have a few more questions here that I'm hoping we can get to before we wrap up, but this has been such a great conversation, and I really, really appreciate hearing from all of you. For Michael and Angelique, how do you, and we've talked about this a little bit in the narrative work, but also, and actually I'm going to ask this to all three of you. When you are thinking about the youth that you work with, how do you actually ensure that you are developing their voice? So what types of initiatives, what types of efforts are each of your organizations taking on right now to make sure that the voice of young people are represented? And Christian, do you want to go first? And also, if you'd like, take a moment in your response to provide some closing thoughts. I think we have time for that.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Yeah, so just very quickly to that question. So thankfully, we have a lot of great media partners across the state. I think what often gets lost in this conversation, especially around COVID, is that Latinos 17 or under are 70% of the cases of COVID within that age group, right? So, and that's part of the reason why that is because, you know, so many Latino families live in these crowded housing conditions, right? If mom and dad are forced to go out to work, they're probably going to get the virus and bring it back home, right? So not only are students struggling to, you know, continue their education, but they're also themselves having to deal with having a positive COVID diagnosis. So on a daily basis, I'm almost chatting with reporters about how do we get this story out there? And like I said, you know, as a foundation, we don't want to just cut checks. Like we're actually not interested in that type of charity, right? I have seen firsthand when I'm able to connect one of the young people that we invest in through the organizations that we invest in and bring them to a reporter at the Associated Press or the Sacramento Bee or the LA Times, and how all of a sudden the tune of elected officials start to change, right? I think what I've learned in my life, after working in Washington, DC for a while, elected officials freak out when they see their name in the newspaper, especially for bad news, right? So I think by not having me as the voice talking about these issues, but providing the voices of young people to the media. And then just finally overall, I will say just around COVID, just to put things in perspective, you know, there are more Latinos infected with COVID-19 just in the state of California than all the total cases in Canada. I'm talking about our state, one ethnic group, than all the total cases in Canada. So when it comes to our groups that are organizing to dismantle structural racism right now within the education system, they need our help. They really do. Ever since our shelter in place in California began, we launched a fund called the Love Not Fear Fund. So we fundraised about $1.5 million to support these families on the ground who need laptops, who need food, who need rental assistance. And we're doing that as much as we can. But this is why I say that we need to engage more systemically with systems and with policy, right? And that's why we're standing firmly behind the Schools and Communities First initiative, right? Because $1.5 million is a penny compared to the billions of dollars that we can get to help address a lot of these issues. And even then, if this does pass, this is part one of the battle, because a lot of the money is going to be filtered into the general funds of like city councils, county governments, school boards. That's where the real fight begins, where we say, we don't want this money, in the case of LAUSD, to say, we don't want this money to be used to buy a tank or a grenade. You know, we need nurses, we need books, right? So I think this is a real organizing opportunity. And, you know, I know the narrative so far has been, you know, the poor Latino community, like they've been suffering. No, we're a resilient community. We really are. You know, the only thing we've known is crisis. And this moment in time, you know, we're really standing up to say enough. And this November, I really hope through the work that we're doing with all of our partners that the best way to say enough is enough to the entire world is on November 3rd. by voting on something for schools and communities first, voting on Prop 16 to repeal the ban on affirmative action. Of course, there are some other things on the ballot, but we will never be heard if we're not heard at the ballot box. So I really encourage everyone here on this webinar to really focus on the election and also to fill out the census, because the census is also a big education justice issue, because that is also how we secure funding for our schools as well.
Thank you, Christian. Two really good points about our civic role and how that is, by taking part in our civic role, we are pushing back against structural racism. Angelique, the question about elevating youth voice, clearly you guys are doing that by ramping up and making sure that more Native students have access to higher education. Are you also doing youth voice work, though, generally?
Yeah, we are. You know, it's really critical to us as an organization that we do really support through funding those efforts. And just to talk a little bit about what we do to make sure that the youth voice is heard, we reach out, like when the COVID epidemic hit, we reached out and put resources into staff to reach out to every single Native student in our database that is a current student, to find out what the problems were and really gather that data. And it really came up housing, food, transportation, and those type of things. We were able to identify and then put resources into them. We also leverage Native voice by having our podcast series so that you can hear directly from the students, and it's not us. We also do surveys to make sure that we're addressing, like annually we do surveys, so that we know that we're hearing what are your needs, what are we doing well, and what really should we be doing differently to make sure your needs are being met. So we do that. I do think that at this moment in time, it's important to, regardless of how difficult things are, Christian, you really spoke to, the resiliency, and I think that this moment in time really speaks to unity, that even through all the difficult times, that we as people of color really unite and have that sense of humanity and compassion, and that we come together and partner and share each other's voice and leverage each other, lift each other up. So that's what I'm going to leave here with, because that's the sense that I have. I have to remain hopeful in all of this, that through this difficult time, change will come, and there will be more unity than ever. So I just encourage each of you to reach out to me personally and just stay connected as much as we can to support each other through these efforts.
Thank you, Angelique. Michael, any closing thoughts for us before we close out the session?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I mean, in terms of youth voice, we operated the adage, nothing about us without us. And I think most importantly, if you're doing work, you have to make sure that the people closest to the pain are closest to the power. And so we have young board members. I mentioned Senegal, who we met, I think, when he was probably 18 years old, and now he's doing incredible work at the Hunt Institute. He sits on my board, as well as Malachi Hernandez, who I think I met when he was 15 years old on the MBK Boston task force. And he sits on my board, and they are fully voting aligned board members that bring incredible value. And there is nothing that we do at My Brother's Keeper Alliance where we do not involve a working group of young people that help us to think through the ideas and sign off on ideas before we bring them forward. And that has also been a hallmark of the work of My Brother's Keeper across the country, where there are My Brother's Keeper fellowship programs, My Brother's Keeper youth advisory task forces. So that's important. And, I also mentioned the work that's happening in California, but I'm just really excited, when we're not just thinking about youth as beneficiaries of programs, like we're going to do this thing to you, but we are also going to make sure that you're involved in creating the solutions to the challenges that you're having to deal with every day, and then becoming the advocate. So we're not waiting to pass the torch to you on some magical day when you're ready. But as we can see with this incredible Black Lives Matter movement, young people are ready, they are at the forefront, and we need to make sure they are prepared. We need to start preparing them in elementary school and middle school because they are not the leaders of tomorrow, they're the leaders of today. And so we've got to make sure that we put them front and center. My only closing comment is, President Obama will often say there's nothing more important to the future of America than whether or not young people like the young people that we serve can achieve their dreams. And so when we think about the work of My Brother's Keeper, it's not just a tug at the heartstrings thing, it's logic. Our Council on Economic Advisors under President Obama did a study that showed if you were a Black baby boy born 25 years ago, you had a 1 in 2 chance of being employed in the United States of America. That was due to incarceration, early death, or other inequities in education and employment. That same study showed that if we could close the labor participation rate between young men of color and their peers, we'd increase GDP by 2%, which is more than $350 billion. And so this is something that we know, if America is going to be globally competitive, if our communities are going to be competitive, if America is going to succeed, we cannot continue to leave our young men and our young women of color on the sidelines, disenfranchised and marginalized. They have to be at the table and a part of the solution to make sure that America can be everything that it was meant to be, and that we live up to the ideals on which this country claimed when it was founded. Even though we know that's not what they meant. Excited to see the young people that are getting in good trouble, thanks to all of you that are working with them to make sure that we are changing the game for our kids and communities.
Well, that is a powerful close, Michael. Appreciate everything that you just said. And also just very thankful for the grace folks have given us and allowing us to go over. This has been a wonderful conversation, a great way to spend our day. Again, thank you so much to Angelique, Christian, and Michael for joining us, and for everyone else in attendance for today's discussion. As Javed and Senegal mentioned earlier, this is part of a series of conversations that the Hunt Institute is having about the role race plays in our education system. The next conversation, titled "The Pressing Need for Culturally Responsive Curriculum," will be on August 6th at 2 p.m. Please go to the Hunt Institute website and register now. Please also remember to take the survey and recommend other people in your network who you think would like to attend these very thoughtful sessions on race and education. I again want to thank you all for joining us, thank the Hunt Institute for pulling us all together, and looking forward to the next conversation that we can have to talk about race and education.